Good afternoon, hello. Is everyone having an awesome Savannah Book Festival so far? Thank you. My name is Ariel Felton, and I'm a member of the volunteer board of directors for the Savannah Book Festival. If this is not your first event, then you have probably heard this spiel that I'm going to give a few times before. You know that it is extraordinary for a board member to get up on a Saturday and stand in between you and the author that you came to see, that you waited in line in the cold to see, but the reason I'm here is an extraordinary circumstance. The cost of nearly everything in our lives has gone up recently. Probably many of you have felt the impact of inflation. I'm here to tell you how it has impacted the festival. Nearly 90% of the festival's income is from sponsorships and donations. Over the last 16 years, that generous support has allowed us to provide Festival Saturday completely for free. We are incredibly proud of this gift to the book lovers of Savannah and our friends from all over the country, many of whom travel here year after year to be with us. But this year, the cost of the festival, everything from transportation to accommodations for our authors, venues, and tent rentals, has increased significantly, while our income has largely stayed the same. Unfortunately, this is unsustainable for us. Each year on Festival Saturday, we have yellow buckets for donations. We have them again this year along with a new Venmo account to make it even easier to give right now by scanning the QR code on the back of your program. So I'm here on behalf of the Board of Directors to ask you to give whatever is comfortable for SBF today. I was at an event earlier where someone mentioned that if you just gave $1 for every author that you saw, that would be a huge, huge help to us today. If you enjoy Festival Saturday just like it is, with dozens of authors speaking at many venues all day long for free, then we need you to make a donation in support of the festival. Thank you so much, and I will get out of the way.
Good afternoon. Welcome, fellow book lovers. My name is Stan Thornton. I'm the session moderator for this particular session of the Savannah Book Festival. Welcome to the 16th annual Savannah Book Festival. This year the festival is presented by the following: the Philip E. and Nancy B. Beekman Foundation, David and Nancy Cintron, Robert Faircloth, the Courtney Knight Gaines Foundation, and the Gerald D. and Helen M. Stevens Foundation. We make a special thank you note to a grant from the Georgia Humanities. We're especially grateful to the Lemon Foundation. They sponsored the First Baptist Church Sanctuary, a beautiful venue offered in honor of Carol and Joe Young, and we appreciate that very much. I'd also like to welcome all of our generous sponsors and literati members, especially those that are here today. Do we have any literati? We thank them for their contributions year to year that make this possible, and to make it possible to have this event put on free and open to the public annually. We have some housekeeping notes that we like to go over. If you've been to any of the other sessions, you've heard them all, but we do like to mention them to those who may be here for the first time, so that you'll know the procedures we usually follow. Our author, George Dawes Green, will be signing festival purchased copies of his book in Telfair Square. It's very near here, less than 2 blocks. He will be there immediately following the presentation to autograph books that he has written that you purchase here. If you need any help finding Telfair Square, please ask one of the ushers, and I'm sure anybody here will be happy to help direct you there. If you're planning to stay in this venue, for the next author presentation by Amanda R. Ward, please move forward to fill the seats as the venue empties. I can tell from the size of this particular crowd that we're going to have a lot of movement on the way out. There'll be also people trying to get in, so if those that decide to stay will help us all and help the ushers and move forward once the pace slows down a bit, then it'll be easy for the next group to come in for the next session. Please make sure that your cell phone is turned off. now would be an appropriate time to take it out and look at it, check it, make sure. We request that although you may use photography if you desire, please do not use flash photography. On the back of your program, you'll find a QR code for a survey. It's very important, and we ask you to please take a moment to complete the survey to share your opinion. The survey helps the Savannah Book Festival with continuous improvement, and especially it helps on the impact of the book festival on the city of Savannah and the encouragement we try to receive from the city of Savannah. Your help in that regard will be extremely important as we continue to seek the assistance of the city of Savannah in supporting this book festival and all that they do. It's also very important to the funding of the arts in the entire Savannah area. The young lady that addressed you first mentioned what they feel now is a more urgent need than in the past for additional donations to support the Savannah Book Festival and its mission. And it will be extremely helpful if you would choose to donate today. As you leave, you'll have the opportunity to meet some ushers in the back with the beautiful yellow buckets, and you'll have an opportunity to donate at that time. We also now at the Savannah Book Festival have the opportunity of using Venmo, if you're familiar with that. I'm too old to know what it is, but my wife knows what it is, and all my children know what it is. That's available if you choose to use it. And then the Savannah Book Festival's website makes it extremely easy for you to go there, find their address, and use any methods there on the website to help the book festival stay alive and to keep the festival going and to maintain the fact that we've always been able to do so in a manner that would be free and open to the public. We're going to have a question and answer session at the conclusion of the author presentation. The microphones we'll use right now are in the hands of the author and the person who's going to share the podium with them. So once they do their original presentation, the ushers will come forward and take these two microphones. I'd like for you to ask you to please, although you may be in the back, if you want to ask your question, please do so. I know the author would love to hear from you as well. We don't just need the ones in the front row to get the first crack at the microphone, but we'll have others trying to identify you. But what I'm trying to do is wait till you get the microphone. It's awfully hard sometimes if you don't have a microphone. The author may hear the question. The others in this huge venue probably will not. And so a question will be answered and he'll light off in one direction and then you won't know why. So please cooperate with us. Try to wait on the person with the microphone and we'll all have a better time and better understanding of Mr. Green's answers to your questions. First, I want to introduce Annie Childress. Annie is here to my right on the podium. She's a Savannah native and longtime bookseller at E. Shaver Bookseller. There she runs and curates the events program. Together, Annie and George, the author, have hosted the book launch for the Kingdoms of Savannah and the historic Gingerbread House this past summer. Since they have begun work on several projects, they have enjoyed many conversations in and around books. Then I will introduce the author. The author is with us today courtesy of Matt Prickett and Jane Griffin, and we appreciate their participation in the book festival to that extent. Mr. Green is the founder of The Moth and Unchained, nonprofit storytelling organizations. Is an internationally celebrated author. His first novel, The Caveman's Valentine, won the Edgar Award and became a motion picture starring Samuel L. Jackson. The Juror was an international bestseller in more than 20 languages. It has been the basis for the movie starring Demi Moore and Alec Baldwin. Ravens was chosen as one of the best books of 2009 by the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Daily Mail of London, and many other publications. Mr. Green grew up in Georgia, and I've already expressed my appreciation to him for coming back to Georgia to visit with you. Please give a warm Savannah welcome to fellow Georgian George Dawes Green.
Hello, George.
Hello, Annie. Does this work?
I think so. I hear
Yeah.
it. I think you're good to go. All right. I wanted to start by thanking you for stepping in on Thursday and giving the opening address for the book festival. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
And it reminded me what a brilliant storyteller you are, which I knew, but I was reminded. So I wanted to start by asking you, Savannah has always been an integral part of your story, and this is a city that calls you back no matter how hard you try to escape. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your relationship with the city and how it began.
Well, it began because of Mama. Some of you who were here on Thursday heard about my Mama. I was raised in little towns up in the north. I was born in Idaho. And then my dad was, he edited weekly newspapers, so they kept folding. And so we kept moving from little town to little town in the north. Finally, when I was 11, my mama got tired of it. She was a true Southerner, or she felt that she was, and we moved down to Brunswick, Georgia. And then every week, every Sunday, Mama would put on this fancy hat and some iris perfume, and we get into the huge Chevrolet Bel Air and then come up Route 17. There was no I-95 in those days. So we would float up Route 17, Mama in her headdress, and it felt like we were in a barge floating up to what Mama always called her capital city, our capital city, because she kept reminding me that I was an 8th generation Savannian. And my mama's name was Inez. She was named for her grandmother. Mama was always called Little Inez. Her grandmother was Big Inez, and she was the patriarch of the family, who had been raised on a plantation and had seen Sherman's army when it arrived, and had all sorts of memories that were very powerful to my mother. There was one story that my mother was just always drilling stories into me. And one story, my Aunt Alice told me this just a couple of years ago when my Aunt Alice was turning 99. She remembered the story perfectly. And it was the story of when my mama was 6 years old. She was brought into the house in the plantation. In the plantation house, there was a room called the Turkish room, which was a room for intimate conversations. Had been previously for smoking, but now it was for intimate conversations. And Big Inez, on the occasion of my mother's 6th birthday, brought little Inez into the Turkish room and gave her a plantation, all of her own, 6,000 acres. And then when my mother went running out of the room, her little sister Alice, who was 4 years old, asked her what had happened. And Mama said, well, Inez gave me a plantation. And then Alice ran up to Big Inez and said, Big Inez, can I have a plantation too? And Big Inez said, child, your name is Alice. You were named for your Yankee grandmother. Why don't you go to your Yankee grandmother and ask her for a plantation? But by the time I was being raised, all the plantations were gone. Mama worked as a receptionist for an optometrist, and we had no money. Nobody in the family had any money left. But we would come up on Sunday afternoons, as I say, we would come up to Savannah to visit the cousins. And they were mostly little old ladies. There was Porter Carr as well, was one sort of younger gentleman, but most of the ladies were also named Inez. And the Inezes would sit around in the extremely hot, stuffy parlor, and Mama and some of the other Inezes, they loved to have seances. And I don't know how many of you, some of you might have heard me tell about tip tabling. But if you don't know what tip tabling is, it was the old form by which you contacted the spirit world. The Ouija board was considered high tech and was banished from the Inez's parlor. So we just used a tip table where you'd sit around and everybody would join pinkies around a little, very rickety, three-legged table. And then, after an appropriate pause, my mother would say, is there a spirit present in this room? And then the table would start to rock and would come back with a sharp rap, meaning that the spirit was here. And the spirit was almost invariably Big Inez. And then Mother would ask Big Inez for a message. And then Big Inez would indicate that there was a message, and then Mother would then start to go through the alphabet. A, B, C, D, E, and remember it was very, very hot in this parlor, and they didn't believe in air conditioning. And I was a little boy, and I was bored to death as the alphabet went. But that's how we got messages in those days before cell phones. And on the particular day that I'm remembering, the first letter was a W, so we had to go all the way down to the W. And then the table went, it kind of tipped, and then came back with a sharp rap. And then they had to find the second letter. A, B, C. Look, I went through this. Y'all are going to have to go through it too now. And sometimes they'd get through down to the very end of the alphabet. X, Y, Z. And they'd realize that the spirit had fallen asleep. And sometimes this room that would be filled, by the way, with either lavender or iris fragrances, because that's all that the Inezes wore. Sometimes there'd be another odor that would sneak in. Somebody was passing gas. This would happen invariably. And then one time, my old great aunt, Inez Wright, said when this odor was unmistakable, she said, Big Inez. And on the day that I'm remembering, the message from Big Inez that we finally got, took more than an hour, was wrong direction. Didn't mean anything to me either. Wrong direction. But the Inezes understood what that meant, because wrong direction meant that since Sherman's armies had arrived, the nation had gone in the wrong direction. There used to be a wonderful world where everyone loved each other. And they would emphasize that always, that that was a good time when everybody felt deep love for each other. Now, I would also come up sometimes to Savannah with my father, who was a Yankee and was a writer and somewhat of a historian. And he had an entirely different view of what Savannah was. I saw this city as this incredibly beautiful, beautiful, I mean, which it is. It is the most beautiful city in the nation. General Oglethorpe had an amazing plan. And it's just, I've always loved it. But it also has been a place of great darkness. And I think that these stories that we got are old ghost stories and today's ghost stories that you find when you go out on the squares miss a lot of the other side of Savannah. And I tried to get both sides into my book, The Kingdoms of Savannah, both the darkness and the beauty and the joy of Savannah. My dad would take me up on little historical tours. One time we went to Wright Square to look for the tomb for Tomachichi. Tomachichi, remember, was Oglethorpe's great friend, and Oglethorpe had consecrated what Wright Square to be remembered and as a place of honor, where the bones of his dear friend would be buried. But instead, what we found in Wright Square, which was very confusing to my father, was this giant wedding cake monument to the man who had owned the railroad. And they had put that monument up in the 1870s. First, they moved Tomachichi off to the corner. And my father, who had loved Oglethorpe and Tomachichi, was infuriated by that, and infuriated that they had put a monument up to the man who built the railroad that allowed cotton to come in from the hinterland, allowing and enabling even more slavery. So there was a darkness between my mother and my father about what this world that we lived in was. They were both alcoholics, and they had screaming arguments into the night, which is another story that I won't tell now, but I will save for another visit. But the point is that, so I came from both of these worlds, both of these views of Savannah, and found it to be, even though I escaped, by the time I was 15, I put my thumb out on Route 17. I just had dropped out of school, and I hitchhiked to New York, and my idea was that I could never come live in this oppressive place. But Savannah brings you back. And so I did come back to live here and have loved it, and am to this day confused as to what the true nature of Savannah is. But it is not only the most beautiful city in the country, it's the most fascinating.
Absolutely. I think you summed it up very well in your book when you titled it Kingdoms of Savannah, because I think Savannah is a community that is made up of tiny little kingdoms all over the place, and you can walk 3 blocks over and end up in a world you never knew existed, and I find that fascinating about our city. I want to now talk a little bit about your book, which I love.
Thank you.
As a thriller writer, do you plan everything out? Do you sit down and have an outline and you know exactly where you're going? Or do you give yourself space to explore where the story might lead you? And I've heard so many authors talk about they hear their characters talking to them. And so I want to know if you have voices in your head.
I do have voices in my head, always. And I often express these voices, which makes people think that I'm crazy. I always talk out my characters. And there are characters like Morgana, who's clearly based on my mama, who's imperious and rather cruel, and incredibly witty and quite brilliant, and somewhat self-made. And so, and then her son Ransom has something to do with me, because has become a terrible loser and
I don't think that's accurate.
well, yeah, Ransom. He doesn't think he's a loser either. Some might say. But I plan the books very, very carefully because they're thrillers. So you got to know, you just have to, in a thriller you have to know not only what the real story is going to be, but also what you want the reader to believe the real story is going to be. So that gets very, very complicated. And it's really the story of a family of detectives. So Morgana and her brood. And so, there's a good many characters, and you have to kind of watch them all. And so I do outline very carefully, and then I go back and sort of re-outline. But I do recall particularly one character in the novel named Betty, who's the maid, and she's good, but she takes way too much Valium, and she just has an accent. As she's based on a real person who was the maid for my cousin Alvin. Alvin Neely. Some of you remember Alvin Neely? Yes. Beautiful Alvin. Betty. I guess I shouldn't say her real name, but she would come to the door and say, "George, how are you?" Conversation with Betty would go on for a long time. When I put Betty in, to the book, she just kept growing. She was just so much fun to hear her talk about how difficult it was to get good medications these days. So I just kept writing more and more Betty into the book. So sometimes the book's characters will run away with the book.
I find that magical. How do you write? Are you the type of writer that gets up every day at 5 a.m. and writes for an hour before even pouring a cup of coffee? Do you sequester yourself in unknown locations? How do you go about actually completing and finishing a book?
It is the age-old difficulty, and something that writers always ask is, how do you do it? And so every writer has a different regime, but you have to have a regime. And that, what you need to do is you need to find out, well, how many words can I comfortably write in a day? You get a day where you just see how it goes. Maybe it's a quarter page. Maybe it's a half page. Maybe it's 3 pages. But if it's a quarter page, that's fine. You'll be done with the draft in a year if you do it every day. And you just have to be rigorous. And it's very, very difficult to be rigorous in this world. Some people are very good about keeping good hours. Some people change their hours. But the thing is, you do just have to keep writing. And what I always recommend to people is when you're writing that first draft, never go back and try to fix it. And I just look down and I see the brilliant author, Janice Ray, is here. And she just nodded her affirmative. That is, if you go back and start fixing, then you'll just keep tinkering and tinkering, you'll never get done. What you really need to do is get a draft. Once you have a draft, some part of you will actually believe that you're a writer. And then it starts to convince the other parts of you. And then you have to write another draft. But at least just get that down.
All right.
So that would be my rule.
So Savannah has a lot of stories that have been written in and about and around it. And as someone who was born here, and makes a point to be involved in the communities here. I was so excited when in your book you engaged with that darkness you were talking about earlier, and that kind of cloud that hangs over Savannah in a really fascinating way. And I was wondering, with all of the research you did for this book, but also your own history with the city, do you have any theories or facts to give us on where you think that darkness originated from?
Wow. Where does the evil of Savannah come from? Such an interesting question. I am willing to say that I think that Savannah is the most evil city in the country. I know that folks from Charleston are very competitive. And I do say that, I mean, they're definitely, there's a real horse race there. But there is something about Savannah. It was, after all, an abolitionist city when it began. Georgia was an abolitionist colony. And so the folks here had to work to get rid of Oglethorpe and to allow slavery into the colony. And it took active work, and it took mostly preachers. And so, when you go back and look at the sermons that were being delivered in the 1740s about the terrible cruelty that was being visited on white people who were being forced to go out into the fields that had been made by God for black people to toil in, that particular strain of hypocrisy that eventually won over all the colonists in Georgia and in England, that there's something about that particular darkness that feels as though, to me, that hypocrisy really got into the Georgia soul. And so when I wrote, Kingdoms of Savannah is set in contemporary Savannah, and it's a contemporary thriller. But the mystery goes way back into the roots of our history and back to those decisions that were being made. And so I just find there's something about that particular hypocrisy that shows up again and again and again in Savannah history. I spend a bit of time talking about Charles Augustus Lafayette Lamar, who was the monster of Savannah in the 1850s. But, when you think that in Savannah in the 1840s, there was an active abolitionist movement here. And slavery was not thought of something that was necessarily going to last. Or it was thought of as kind of a necessary evil. But Charlie Lamar and the Fire Eaters managed to change people's view and turn them to think that, well, actually, slavery was really a good thing. And again, they used the pulpits to preach that this was God's way on earth. And it took a lot, again, there's that strain of terrible hypocrisy that comes in. And Charlie Lamar and the Fire Eaters believed not only that they were going to keep slavery, but that they were going to expand it, that they were going to get rid of the prohibition of the Atlantic slave trade, and they were going, probably, if they could, to provoke a secession, maybe a civil war, which they'd win quickly, and then they could establish an empire of slavery after conquering Mexico and Brazil. A real empire of slavery under God. That sort of darkness is, that seems to tie in to the earlier darkness of the folks who got rid of the malcontents, the folks who got rid of Oglethorpe. So, at any rate, the history of Savannah does seem to me to be particularly dark, and it goes, you know, I think that there was incredible corruption here in the 1930s when the welcome mat was put out for any industry that wanted to come and use the water, and there wouldn't be any environmental regulations. And so you have, by 1970, you'll have Ralph Nader coming in and saying, well, this is really the second most polluted waterway in the country. Again, there was a sense of people going along with whatever the powerful interests wanted, and again, all of these are very complex motives, and all of this that was being done were being done by people who could be beautiful and wonderful. Big Inez was, you know, a beautiful woman. All of my cousins, Inez, they were all the loveliest people in the world. So I don't mean in any way to say that this wasn't complex, but this is the fascinating thing about living in this city. You're living in the most beautiful city, and a city that is just filled with darkness. And I hope there are many, many more books about Savannah.
One of my favorite moments in your book is between Jack and Morgana, and them trying to figure out their relationship as Jack begins to engage with Morgana's family's history and her place in all of that. And I thought you handled that really beautifully, and I found it very compelling.
Thank you.
All right, so.
Jack is black, but has been adopted into the family, loves her grandmother, Morgana, and yet, how can she live in this world of people who seem to accept compromise all the time? It is, I just think that's the theme of Savannah, is compromise. It's how we, and you know, to some extent, it's good. I never mean, when I have those arguments between Jack and Morgana, I don't think I let anybody win.
No, I don't think you do. And I think it speaks to something that modern society is struggling with, which is this huge polarity that we're dealing with. And you gave us nuanced characters who genuinely love each other, but also stand on opposite sides of a huge issue. And so you have them begin to question, all right, how do we bridge this gap? And how do we continue to love and respect one another, but also not ignore the problem that's in front of us? And I thought that was a really wonderful thing to engage in when we do have this polarized society that really struggles to argue.
Yeah, I find that the argument is just horrendous now, the screaming, the constant. You know, the constant judgments and screaming. Life is very, very difficult. It's very difficult to work any of this stuff out. And it should be pointed out. I pointed it out recently in a talk in Brooklyn. I reminded Brooklynites that during the Civil War, the mayor of New York City tried to secede and join the South. So New York City was completely involved in all of this as well.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. We're going to open up the floor to questions now, and I'm going to run all these mics to the volunteer.
Oh, yes.
And then you'll get to go, yes, you do.
Yes, I will check it. So, now I've got my pulpit. And now, Charlie Lamar, we will talk about whether you are in heaven or where else you might be. God, it's so much fun to be up here. I had no idea how seductive power is. By the way, can we have a round of applause for Annie Childress? Those were great questions. And also, can we also have another round of applause for a few more folks, for Matt and Jane, who are the sponsors, and also the founders of the Savannah Book Festival. It's so lovely to be in your presence. Thank you. And to Ariel Felton, who just came up, and the board member, who is a powerful force in Savannah. Thank you. And also, can I just say that I just was seduced by Stan's lovely voice. I can assure you the Inezes would have loved to have had you there. Okay.
How frequently do you make it back to Savannah? Do you have family here?
I have family in Brunswick. My brother's still in Brunswick. I had my cousin Alvin until just a few months ago when he passed. It's been a terrible time in the city for the past, and the old timbers have fallen this year. A lot of you will remember Alvin Neely and John Duncan, who also passed recently, and Jane Fishman, our brilliant Jane Fishman. And so it does feel to me that it could be I was thinking, oh, maybe I won't be able to get here as often as I did. I would always, I had a house here, but even when I didn't have my house, I could always stay at Alvin's. But I feel as though Savannah is completely in my blood, and I will never stop coming. My editor has asked me to do a sequel, so I think I'll be coming down to just keep rooting around in the nasty parts of Savannah. When I came here to the hotel, I got a ride. The limo driver was an ex-cop, a black police officer, who had spent 30 years working with internal affairs. He said, yeah, there's still plenty of corruption here. So I hope to keep coming a lot. Also, can I just mention quickly, I don't want to dwell on it, but Dr. Presley is here, Dr. Paul Presley. And he has been working, and I have been working, and many others are now working. There's an area in the novel, there's a place that I call the Kingdom. But during the Revolutionary War, there were hundreds of black soldiers who fought on behalf of England. And when the war was over and America had won, these folks didn't want to go back into slavery. So many of them went to a little island up the river about 15 miles north of here in what is now the Savannah Wildlife Refuge. And they joined, there was already an extant community of Maroons, they're called, the fugitives from slavery. And there they built what was really a fortress. That is, they built a wall around an area that was half a mile long and several hundred yards wide. And they built more than 20 houses, and they had lots of boats, and they had crops that they were growing, and they were hunting and trapping, and they were flourishing. And eventually, other fugitive slaves from up and down the Savannah River came to join them. And there were perhaps as many as 200 people living there in this community, which was really the only fortified Maroon community in the United States, a real, genuine center of black resistance in the midst of the slave-holding South. And it was finally defeated, although they whooped the Georgia militia. Finally, the Georgia militia got together with South Carolina militia, and they were defeated. And that was 235 years ago, and very, very little has ever been written about these folks, although a great deal of documentary records exist. Dr. Presley is coming out with a book in just a few months that really is an examination of some of the folks who lived there and the amazing stories. And that area, the kingdom, plays a vital role in my book, but we also have begun, just a number of people have become so interested in this community, and we've been, some foundations have reached out to us, and so we're at the very early stages of saying we can do an archaeological excavations, and we can find this fortress, and we can bring this story into the curriculum of Georgia schools. And so we're really excited about that, and we have an organization that we now call the Friends of Bear Creek. So if you all are interested, please come and talk to me or Dr. Presley. And it's an amazing, exciting thing. So that's another thing that's going to be bringing me back.
Yeah, thank you. As someone who comes from a very large family, I thought you captured sibling rivalry so well.
Wait, I'm sorry, I can't find you. I'm
Back here.
There you are.
Yep.
Yes.
As someone who comes from a large family, from Brooklyn, by the way, that the way you captured sibling rivalry was so intense, not only because of, obviously, the parental creation of rivalries, but even to the point of she's going to think I'm fat and tired and looking at this because it's always there, sibling to sibling. And it just left you really wanting to hear more, and I'm thrilled to hear that there's possible sequel because you created so many characters with issues, and I think really enjoyed it.
It is something that I did get from my family. We had 5 kids in my family. And we have so many issues. And Mama had all those issues, and Aunt Alice had all those issues. But, honestly, it's true. Every family, y'all belong to families with issues.
George, I'm so glad you're here. I've recently completed reading the biography of Frederick Douglass by Blight, and he makes very clear, Douglass does, that I'm a bitter Southerner. Some people here know what that means. It's not just down here that we have problems. We have problems everywhere. The largest slave auction in American history took place right here in Savannah, Georgia.
Yeah.
And who owned the slaves? Where did he live?
Well, that was Reynolds, and he lived up in Philadelphia, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
Yeah. By the way, the auction took place at a racetrack. It was owned by Charlie Lamar. So they were all a very tight-knit group. By the way, Matt, just want to say, Matt, being the founder of this book festival, Matt and I spend a lot of time, because as a lot of you know, I'm the founder of The Moth. So, thank you. It's tough to be a founder because if an organization is a good organization, it lives on its own, and there are 1,000 voices that go pouring into it. And it is probably the hardest thing about being a founder is to shut up and sit down and let other people do it. But Matt and I have always been able to commiserate with each other on just how difficult that is sometimes. Anyway.
Well, I guess I was wondering if you could expand a little more on the weeping time. Like, when did you first hear about that? Because it's really only come into modern awareness, I think 2008. And then how did you go about researching it and finding out more? And then I also just wanted to say, it's amazing that you talked about the Truman Camp clearing in your book,
Yeah.
and then that actually happened a couple months after your book was released. So good job predicting events.
Okay, and there will be time for one more question after this. Stan tells me. First, the Harry, so one of the kingdoms in the book is the encampment underneath the Harry S. Truman Parkway exit ramp where it meets President Street. I spent a lot of time there with friends. And I even have, if you go to thekingdomsofsavannah.com, I have the recordings of some stories told by some of the folks who lived out there. They're just brilliant, brilliant storytellers. But it is true that every few years, I mean, really quite rightly, the police would go in and clean out the camps. The camps would become very dangerous. They are dangerous places. When I say rightly, I mean that's very difficult to decide what's right when it comes to homeless people, because I have many friends who are homeless, and they don't want to be rousted from the homes that they have made there. But again, that's another of the Savannah conundrums. But it is true, the police come in, and that area, that encampment is called the Truman Marriott. And the police will come in regularly and bulldoze it. And then, for some reason, the Truman Marriott lives on and on and on. It always comes back. And it reminds me that you there was a first part of your...
The weeping time, how did you research that?
I had always been interested, of course, in Savannah history since I was a boy, but it was John Duncan. How many of you all remember John Duncan? Let's give him a big round of applause. He was John, who just passed a few months ago. He was just an incredible force, a lover of history and reading, and he passed. But 25 years ago, he mentioned to me at a lunch, we were talking about sort of the Maroon communities, and he said, "Did you know, George, that there were soldiers who had fought for the King of England who went and set up a Maroon community?" And it was just a little notion in his head. And I went to look it up, and I couldn't find anything, but finally I went to the Georgia Historical Society, and I started to find some of the documentary records of the militia commanders, and it was an amazing experience doing that research. And then I decided, I'm going to go out and find this encampment. So my brother was an archaeologist, and Chad Ferries, who lives in Savannah, extraordinary Chad, gave me a canoe, and he took his canoe, and we went up, and we realized it's miles and miles of a land up there. We're never going to find it. But now recently archaeologists say, no, we have the tools now. We think that we will be able to find it. So we're really excited about going to look for it. And I guess, is there time for one more question? I don't know. Stan? Are we done? Or do we have time for one more? One more. Okay, one more question. There we go. Yes.
Can you pass this down, please? You spoke about the darkness in Savannah.
This beautiful voice is coming out of...
Here we go. Oh, you spoke
there
about
you
the
are.
darkness in Savannah. Darkness can only exist in the absence of light. Is there any light in Savannah?
Yes, I may not have been clear enough. And when you read the book, I think you'll find. When I talk about the beauty of Savannah, Savannah is a beautiful place not simply because of these incredible trees and because of our squares and the architecture and the planning of General Oglethorpe. And it's also a beautiful place because it's still a place where there are communities. And I think that's what the Kingdoms of Savannah really refers to, is the idea of these beautiful, deep communities that we have here. On Thursday night, I was able to talk a bit about the cafes here. And I love Sentient Bean, but I really think this extraordinary cafe, Foxy Loxy, with its courtyard, and to be able to sit out there in that courtyard and have folks, all of your friends, they're also working, and then they'll come and they'll talk to you, and nobody gets any work done. But all of these communities that make up Savannah have made it into a beautiful city. And one of the reasons, that Savannah hasn't had all the terrible strife of other cities, again, is the strength of these communities, and that's another vein of Savannah. So if you ask, is there light in Savannah? It's really nothing but light. My favorite, thanks. My favorite Savannah Parjani wrote a book that he calls Dreams of the Immortal City. And Aubergine has had, throughout his life, nothing but trouble from Savannah. But he also feels that it's a place of great beauty. And so when he calls it the Immortal City, he's really celebrating it. So with that, I can say thank you so much to all of you for coming out.